towards you when you respond with respect, even when others are not treating you with that same respect. So I think it's more the nuance of the favor of God in this case. You know, it's an expression of grace, maybe of God is gracious to you, you be gracious to others. This is not just saying anything goes and you just accept anything as you don't call wrong right, but you also have an understanding that we find grace from God, we find favor from God whenever we suffer unjustly. And I think you see examples of that throughout the Bible, that those who humble themselves, those who do not resort to evil in the face of evil, that is living within the grace of God. God finds favor with that, and He is present with us. We're tapping into His grace during that. So maybe some of those things are at work there. Yeah.
That word fear in that verse also makes it, when you're a child, you go to church, so you don't want to go to hell. So that's a different fear than the submissive, humble, loving, godly fear.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Let's look at verse 20, because I think this is a general principle not only for if you're working in a position or in a household where things are unreasonable, and even if there is unjust treatment toward you, but in verse 20, when you sin, and some translations will say are harshly treated, or I think some will go ahead and use a stronger word there, but for punishment. So when you sin and are harshly treated, if you endure that with patience, he's saying that's, what favor is that? Even God says in other places that, sin, institutions don't bear the sword for nothing. There is a sense of consequence for our actions whenever we sin. It doesn't have to be eternal consequences. We can seek God's favor, repent, be forgiven of sin, but there can still be consequences for sin. You know this as a parent. Your child messes up, your child does something that's really wrong that you've already expressed that is wrong, and they have done it. Doesn't mean you stop loving them. It doesn't mean you stop extending grace to them. It doesn't mean that you end the relationship. But it does mean that you teach them through that moment, and part of that teaching is through consequences for the action. Sometimes there are natural consequences for our actions. Sometimes consequences are inflicted by someone who is in a position of authority. So he's saying if you do wrong and you face consequences for your doing wrong, that's not the same as suffering for the times when you have not done wrong. When someone is treating you with harshness, and even though you have done right, when you have done right, sometimes because you have done right, and others mistreat you. That's the situation of Jesus that we're about to read about. That's what he's going to come back to. Jesus did nothing deserving of what he faced. There was no sin at all that he was facing consequences of. He took on your and my sin and bore the punishment for it, the consequences of it. But he himself did not sin to lead to that. And this is something that's going to come up again in 1 Peter. When we get into chapter 3 and chapter 4, it's going to keep coming back to this idea that if you suffer, make sure you suffer for what is right, for doing what is right. Because if you suffer for doing what is wrong, how are you any different than the people of the world? Suffering for doing what is wrong, that's the natural. That just naturally flows from what's wrong. But make sure when you suffer, it is for doing what is right. Okay, John?
With Matthew 5, when he talks about, you heard it said to love your neighbor, which is good, right? Nothing wrong with that. That's exactly what we ought to be doing. But then he takes it one step further and says, okay, that's great. But what I'm really asking of you is to love your enemies at the next level. And so I see a parallel there because it's the same thing, right? Suffering for doing bad, being corrected by your boss, by your spouse, whatever that might be when you're wrong. That's a good and righteous thing. I mean, we ought to. We ought not to get defensive, and react that way, even though it's natural. But the varsity stuff, the graduate level, like next level spiritual, practice, I think, is just that, doing it when we're right, and actually question is how do you go about that, and not just be a format, but I do think there's a parallel there in concept that he's looking for.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' Beatitudes definitely leads up to that idea of that. That's the last of the Beatitudes. That is a point of, because I think they build on one another. And this is the spiritual maturity that you are to reach, to where you can suffer for the sake of righteousness. And that you can take joy in that even whenever that happens. Now, there is any of these passages in the New Testament that, and again, here, but some passages that do use the word slave, the word doulos. Many of these have been misused throughout history. The whole point of this passage is not telling you that it's okay for you to unjustly treat people who live with you. It's not endorsing ownership of other people. That's certainly not what this passage means with this word. It is saying that in the context of the first century, some people who were becoming Christians may have found themselves in this type of situation, this type of relationship, whether they were considered a slave or a servant, whether they were an employer with an unreasonable boss, but they had to be in that position at the time. All of this, if you find yourself in this position, let me ask you this question. Is it okay to seek a change in your social status, your employment status, if it's presented to you? Is that okay?
Absolutely. You need a market.
Okay. So we and where I'm going with this is, I think a lot of people who are in a position of authority might use a passage like this, misuse it to say, okay, I own you as human property. You have to submit to me, and you cannot do anything to change your position. That obviously is a misuse of this passage. But for those who find themselves in that position, Romans 7 is going to say, because it's going to even use the word slave as if, were you a slave whenever you were called to Christ? Were you a free man whenever you were called to Christ? And it's going to talk about that some, but it's going to say, it's not Romans 7, 1 Corinthians 7. I don't want to give you all the wrong passage. 1 Corinthians 7. It's going to say, if you have an opportunity to gain your freedom, then gain your freedom. It's going to say that. So if you have opportunity to get into a better situation where you are not subject to this kind of unjust treatment, then do so. However, how you go about that change is important. You don't want to respond to evil with evil. You want to, as long as you are in this position, even if it's not ideal for you, then you need to go about what you do with a respect and honor and an endurance until your situation improves. So I think that's a lot of what he's getting at here. Again, a deeper dive into the different types of slavery and servanthood and those things in this culture, and even the history of Israel, and when slavery is mentioned in the Old Testament, that's going to demand a deeper study, and it's a good study, and I want to do it. But we don't want to get we're just mainly sticking here in 1 Peter 2 as far as what this is saying. But the main principle is here, don't resort to evil when you're experiencing evil from other people. You go about If you can change circumstances, then do so, but you've got to do so in a Christ-like way. You do not do it in a way where you resort to the tactics of the world in order to do it. Any other thoughts on this? Okay.
I only bring this up because it's become in the last 50 years such a problem for a lot of folks. But we're obviously taught not to forsake the assembly.
Okay.
And yet probably all of us here have had to work on Sundays on occasion that our jobs required. How should we, I guess, rationalize that in our own minds about it's okay?
Yeah, and I think that's part of why the churches over the last century began also meeting on Sunday nights, was because I know there's benefit in meeting twice because you can. It's just this is a day of assembly, and we should take advantage of every moment that we have with God's people. But that was part of how that tradition started, of having two assembly times, was so that those who may have had a job where they had to work on a Sunday morning, maybe they could still gather on a Sunday evening. So I think hopefully churches recognize that and try to accommodate, if that's a widespread issue in their congregation, try to do everything they can to accommodate the person who's in a position. But I would say, again, you work on changing your circumstances to where you try to either work it out with the position that you're in to be able to be off of work for the time of the assembly, or you work on changing that job. I think that if it's, I won't tell someone that they are sinning because they are in a job that they have to have for money, and it is, at the moment, it is demanding them work on Sunday. You've got to find a way to have some assembly time with the saints if you're in that situation. But long term, you want to try to change position to where you can be with the people of God. I would say, again, if you're in a position where your job would prevent you from meeting at any time on Sunday with the saints, and they would not work with your schedule on that, then I think you've got to do everything in your power to find a different job with that, while still being respectful, as this says. Okay, good questions. Anybody else? Okay, let's talk about Jesus. Okay, this whole chapter now is going to be tied together with the example of Jesus. Verse 21, for you have been called for this purpose. So you've been called to suffer. That's one of the themes of First Peter. You are a resident alien. The world's not going to understand you, and there are going to be moments whenever you suffer for reasons that you do not deserve. And you've been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. Now, how many of you have used this expression of following Jesus in his steps or walking in his steps before? That we're used to that. I would agree that it applies to all kinds of things. Anywhere where Jesus goes, anywhere he leads me, I will safely go. We will follow the footsteps of Jesus anywhere they go. But in this context, where are the footsteps of Jesus going? To the cross. That's where they're going here. And it says that you have an example to follow in his steps. Now, the rest of this is going to tell you not just that he suffered, it's going to show you how he responded to suffering. Okay, how he responded to suffering. First principle is this: he committed no sin. He committed no sin. Now, this passage is drawing upon the language of Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is one of the great passages in the Bible of what is going on the cross and what Jesus is doing in that moment, of the evil that is arrayed against him, what he's doing on our behalf. But here's a couple things that it's going to say. He committed no sin. So he did not resort to evil to fight evil. Nor was any deceit or guile found in his mouth. Now that goes back earlier this chapter, verse 1 of this same chapter. That's one of the things that we are to put away. Y'all see that there? Either deceit or guile in verse 1 or something along those lines. That's what we are to put away from who we are becoming. Jesus did not have deceit in his mouth. Why mention that? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, there was no attempt to, we're going to talk in our sermon this morning about shifting blame to others, or trying to, you could try to wiggle out of something in a way that would still be unjust. Even if you were being treated unjustly, you could respond by saying, well, I didn't actually do it, this guy over here did, and to put it on them. You could do that, and Jesus could have done that. He could have done all kinds of deceiving things if he had wanted to, but no deceit was found in his mouth. Look at this next one. What do y'all have in verse 23? Do y'all have being reviled? Any other translations there?
Did not retaliate.
Okay, did not retaliate. When they hurled their insults at him, yes. When they hurled their insults at him or being reviled. So when he was being mocked or reviled or insulted are some of the words there that could be used. He did not mock or revile or insult in return. Or the principle there, he did not retaliate. He did not respond to evil with evil. While suffering, he uttered no threats. But, here's what he did instead. He kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. The one who judges righteously. Okay, there's a lot in this verse. So we've already said, general principle, he committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth, and whenever he was being mocked or insulted, he did not respond to that with insults in return. Why is that so tempting for us whenever we are insulted or mocked to respond with mocking or insult? Okay, it's a work of the flesh. Okay. It almost can become a reflex. Unless you've been spiritually trained otherwise, it can become a reflex to respond to that with throwing something back at them.
I was just going to say, when someone does something like that, it hurts us in a way. It hurts. It really hurts. And so a hurt thing, its natural reaction is to flash out.
That's right. There's one of my favorite movie scenes. This is a little more lighthearted here, but it's The Sandlot. One of my favorite movies is The Sandlot. Kids playing baseball. In fact, our softball team last year got together and watched it after our softball season to laugh a little bit and watch a good team, since we weren't much of one. But we're going to be better this year. But there's this scene where there's two rival teams that come up. There's the guys who play in the Sandlot, and then there's the guys that have the fancy uniforms that are used to playing all the time. And they ride their bikes up, and they start throwing the insults at each other. And the one, you have to top the other one's insult. If they throw an insult at you. And of course, the ultimate insult that they get to is you play ball like a girl. I mean, that is the one they're like, oh, he went there. And that's so, but that just shows you, I know it's a humorous scene, but that type of thing we can fall into so easily, that if they, you're mocking me, do you realize all the things I can say about you? And man, I see this is definitely part of our political culture right now, and of not just politicians, but all the pundits and everything else. It is just the whole idea of owning someone is make sure your insults are stronger than their insults, it's very much a part of our culture. In many ways, it always has been, but even more so in recent years. There's just this lack of decorum. There's lack of respect in interactions. I mean, you even see it with some what should be debates between people who handle themselves like grown-ups and they don't. And so you've got this idea here of while being insulted, he did not insult in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats. Okay, he did not threaten in return, and that's key here. We sing the song. He could have called 10,000 angels. He didn't threaten to do that. He didn't threaten to destroy them. Nathan?
Going back to that, notice he was found out. There's a verse in Numbers. Have you read it where it says God is not a man? And a lot of people that don't believe that Jesus is part of the Godhead, like we do, we'll go to that in Numbers. But if you keep reading, it says God is not a man that he should lie. In Numbers says that. So it's like, they don't read the second half of it. So that would just affirm more that Jesus is part of the Godhead.
Yes.
Because of what Peter says here.
That's right. God is not like any other man. Right.
It says that specifically that he does not lie.
That's right.
And so Jesus didn't lie. So that affirms not only is that verse used incorrectly, it would actually support more that Jesus is part of God.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Nathan. So he didn't lie. He didn't insult. He didn't threaten. What he did instead, and the New American Standard uses the word entrusted himself. What does that mean? Or do you have another word there? What? Say what's the other word? He committed himself. Okay, he committed himself, or he entrusted himself. It is very much related to the word submission. It is putting yourself in the hands of someone else. Yeah, it's the trust. I mean, it is, y'all ever done the trust fall exercise where you're doing team building stuff and you have to, do you trust us? And you're either blindfolded or closing your eyes and you have to fall back and you are entrusting yourself into the hands of others to catch you. Okay, Jesus is entrusting himself that even if his body dies, and he knows that it will in this moment, but he is entrusting himself to the God who judges righteously. So he is entrusting that the whole matter of the wrong that is being done to him, that number one, he's taking that wrong upon himself in this moment. And the opportunity will be there for these same people who've crucified him and for the whole world to be redeemed of that, to be forgiven of that. But number two, even if they refuse that and persist in their unjust ways, there will be a judgment in the end. There will be a final judgment that will come. And that's key for any of us when we are facing mistreatment. If you think, well, he's getting away with it, she's getting away with it, they need to get what's coming to them, they need to be insulted, they need to be threatened, someone needs to do to them what they're doing to others, leave it in the hands of God. He knows far more than we do, and he will make things right in the end. I mean, that is, even if it doesn't happen, even within the span of my lifetime, he will make it right in the end. He is the righteous judge. That's exactly it. That's it. Yeah. So for our part, we don't respond to evil with evil. We don't respond to insult with insult. This doesn't necessarily mean that we don't. There are times when we should speak up about something being wrong. Okay, but this means we do not respond to wrong with wrong.
Well, Jesus had fed a lot of the people that were mocking him and beating him. He had fed them and healed them.
Yeah, that's right.
A lot of people that were hurling insults and rocks and beating him were the same people that he healed.
That's right. That's it. Nathan, do you have another comment?
Oh, yeah, Jesus was able to do it. He had a power that he rested on beyond this world. So, that he knew he was going to be risen, from the dead. So, because of what he said, like John was belly of the well for 3 days for 3 nights.
Yeah.
The Son of Man will be in the earth for 3 nights. So he knew he had a power that's beyond this world that he rested assured on. That's why he was submissive. And we can build that same confidence. We're afforded that same confidence being risen. Like
That's right.
1 Corinthians.
Yeah. Even if they take this body, I've got a better one coming. So that's okay. That should be our mentality too. If you look at one more thing I want to point out here, this is actually what we would call grammatically the imperfect tense, which just means it is ongoing action. So he kept entrusting himself in this situation in his life, which means he'd already been doing that even before the cross. This was just a continuation of who Jesus was all along. If you look at verse 24, now we're coming back to some of the language of Isaiah 53. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross. Interesting. Do any of y'all have tree in your translation? It should be tree. It is the word for tree that is used here, which actually makes us think of the book of Deuteronomy 21:23, which says, "Cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree." So he bore it on the tree so that, here's the purpose, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. This was the purpose. He died for. He did not die for you so that you would just live the way the world lives and respond to evil the way the world responds to evil. He died so that you might die to sin. He's taken it. We find peace on the cross. For by his wounds you were healed. And that's definitely language out of Isaiah 53. And then this last verse is also from Isaiah 53. For you were continually straying like sheep. This is who you are. You're a sheep. But now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Shepherd and guardian or overseer of your souls. Shepherd's going to be used of Jesus again in chapter 5, even when it talks about church elders working under him as the great shepherd. He's shepherding us, and we come back to him. Appreciate y'all's thoughts. David wanted me to announce that he has coats that belong to Glenda today, and so you can see David if you're interested in looking at those coats to see if any of them fit you and you'd like one. Okay, let's wrap up there.